If you ask me, what defines survival horror games is their unique relationship with tension. Whereas most games focus on short-term bursts of tension and release, survival horror is all about extending that tension for much longer periods of time, if not an entire playthrough. The prime example, of course, being Resident Evil, where there are a finite number of healing items, ammo pickups, and even ink ribbons which let you save the game. The knowledge that all your supplies come in such limited quantities casts a shadow over the entire game, causing you to continuously wonder if that one stray zombie bite is going to end up costing you your one 3 or 4 hours down the line. This kind of pervasive tension is one of my favorite game design tropes, so lucky for me it's not one that's just limited to horror titles. Games like Battle Garega and Pikmin certainly can't claim to be horror, but have systems which constantly ratchet up tension in much the same way that survival horror games do. It's a style of design that's agnostic towards genre and tone, and although it may have been popularized by Resident Evil, it definitely wasn't started by it. If you're a fan of the series, you may be familiar with the game Sweet Home, a JRPG released exclusively on the Famicom, which has been long documented as the original inspiration for Resident Evil. That bit of trivia has unfortunately overshadowed the work itself, which is a real crime. Sweet Home is more than just a fun fact, it's an absolutely fascinating game, and by examining both it and its own inspirations, I think we can learn quite a bit about both horror games and JRPGs. I don't think it's a coincidence that Sweet Home is considered the blueprint for survival horror, and it's a JRPG. Japanese role-playing tropes were essential in determining what survival horror would eventually become. We can see this pretty clearly if we go one step further back on the evolutionary chain to the very first JRPG, Dragon Quest. Needing to meet the limitations of the Famicom's controller as well as a young target audience, Dragon Quest had to rein in its RPG aspirations pretty severely, and so the finished product was a game with one party member, no character customization, and severely limited attack options. Making up for its combat deficiency, the game instead focuses on adventure game elements, item puzzles, exploration, and inventory management. All of these, of course, ended up being survival horror staples, but that last element is of particular note to me. See, whereas the majority of JRPGs have essentially bottomless inventories, the one found in the original Dragon Quest is positively minuscule. It's easy to write it off as a result of the game being dated, but if you actually think about it for more than 5 seconds, it's a pretty interesting design choice. It's a constant stressor that reframes combat as little more than an elaborate way to stretch your thin inventory even thinner in between the actually engaging adventure game bits. Sort of the inverse of a lot of more modern JRPGs, where combat is the most complex part of the game, and overworld segments come off like glorified segues to the next plot beat. This is even more apparent in the Dragon Quest remake, where golden experience was doubled, substantially reducing the amount of time spent fighting. Combat itself was never the important part. The more interesting question was whether you were going to engage or run away. Whoa, just like Resident Evil! They even both use green herbs as healing items, and I refuse to believe that that's a coincidence. The original Dragon Quest owns, honestly. Its simplicity and strong focus on resource management makes it one of my favorites in the genre. But that being said, while it scratches a sort of survival horror itch for me, I still have my reservations about how equipped both it and the rest of its genre are to build and maintain any real kind of tension. And this brings us back to Sweet Home. Games from this era, and especially RPGs, are often derided as being thoughtless, thrown-together experiments, but Sweet Home shows a deep understanding of genre conventions and how to toy with them. Famously, the game features a permadeath system, something which would require a lot of changes to the JRPG formula to work properly. The game manages to pull this off in a few key ways. Firstly, the scale of the game is significantly reduced. Rather than an overworld so large you need a supplemental map to keep track of it, Sweet Home takes place in a single mansion, reducing the amount of physical space while also increasing the density of Dragon Quest-style item puzzles. Secondly, there is no shop or currency system. Any item can be taken free of charge, assuming you have the space for it. And this is on top of the fact that all healing items fully heal the HP and MP of your entire party. Lastly, and most importantly, the combat features a few small but significant changes from the Dragon Quest standard. In an effort to stack the odds in your favor, your party members will always act before the opponent and will always land their attacks. This means that once you've outleveled an enemy, you'll kill them on the first turn with 100% consistency, making level grinding extremely feasible. The way fleeing works is unique too. Over the course of the game, you'll need to split characters into different team compositions, and in order to flee an encounter, each team member needs to individually pass a skill check. As a byproduct of this, the smaller your team, the more likely it is you'll be able to flee an encounter successfully, which ensures struggling players aren't kicked while they're down. It's tempting to say these design decisions were a mistake, as they defang what should have been an unrelenting, brutal survival horror nightmare, but not only are these accommodations welcome, they're sort of necessary, because despite Sweet Home's focus on resource management, JRPG design is kind of at odds with compelling resource management. I'll give you an example. Late into my first playthrough, I was fighting a knight enemy with my character Akiko on low health. I mashed the A button through the fight sequence like an idiot, and the knight attacked Akiko and killed her. I started a panic, as she's probably the most useful character in the game, but luckily I had saved just a few steps before that encounter, so I reloaded that fight, and instead of giving Akiko a health item, I just mashed through it in the exact same way. But this time I won, because the knight decided to attack someone else instead of her. Do you see the problem here? In both scenarios, I made literally identical choices, yet in the first I was punished, and in the second I was rewarded. It should be pretty obvious to everyone that RPGs heavily rely on random elements, but I don't think we discuss how those elements directly undermine a lot of what fans claim to love about this genre nearly enough. One of the more common arguments in favor of turn-based combat is that it requires deep strategy and careful planning, but what exactly does having the outcome of a fight dictated by random numbers have to do with strategy? In all fairness, it's not like skill plays no part here. A more knowledgeable player than me would have properly managed Akiko's health and never found themselves in my situation to begin with. But my point is that when one input can produce two entirely opposing outputs, your ability to make informed decisions is deeply muddied. It's possible to make better choices, but what constitutes a baseline good choice in any given moment is sometimes unknowable. It's a problem sort of inherent to JRPG combat, one that really affects my ability to connect with them. But it's not just a personal issue. Leaving important outcomes up to chance changes the way a game needs to be designed. You always have to account for the unluckiest player, and this restricts what you can do as a designer pretty severely. I've already talked about how the game had to remove and simplify certain combat elements to offset the randomness, but taking a look at the game's spiritual successor, we can illustrate this even further. My favorite game mechanic in Resident Evil, and really one of my favorite mechanics in general, is the ink ribbon. You can't save the game unless you're carrying one in your inventory, and there's a limited quantity. Of course, there's a bit more than the average player would ever need, but even on repeat playthroughs, I always find myself stopping to think for a bit if now is the appropriate time to save. It's the embodiment of survival horror to me, the feeling of knowing that something as simple as saying yes to a text prompt can have drastic, unforeseen consequences, and the anxiety that results from that. And unless you're okay with the player having the potential to softlock themselves, ink ribbons can only really exist in a game like Resident Evil. It can be as ballsy with its save system as it wants because the combat is in real time. Players can avoid all damage in the game as long as they have the execution skill, and even exhausting all the ammo of every gun isn't enough to doom you, as you always have the knife to fall back on. While obviously difficult, no damage, no saves, and knife-only runs are absolutely possible in Resident Evil, but the same can't be said for Sweet Home. The randomized turn-based combat sort of forces Sweet Home into having an unlimited save system. Not only that, but you can save anywhere at any time, deflating much of the tension in the hopes that players won't accidentally softlock themselves. To the game's credit, there is only a single save slot, which does produce some anxiety in the player, but it's a far cry from Resident Evil's system. This isn't to say that either Resident Evil or its remake are perfect survival horror games. The focus on static item puzzles over the kinds of dynamic enemy encounters you'd see in a game like Resident Evil 4 means that you can't replay it endlessly without starting to ruin it for yourself. The game really works best when you're playing it for the first time, with no idea how long you're going to be waiting for the next health item or ink ribbon. As the unknown becomes known, the horror starts to dissipate. This is also a problem I noticed in Sweet Home, and in a much more pronounced way. The longer I played, the more I realized how much the combat stacks the deck in the player's favor. It made me start to see through the design, and by the end I really had a hard time taking it seriously as a horror title. If survival horror is all about the anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen a few hours down the line, what happens when there's only 30 minutes of the game left? If you know that there's so little ground left to cover, that none of the enemy types are a high enough level to pose a threat, how are you supposed to be afraid? Sweet Home doesn't have an answer for this, and the game's second half suffers greatly for it. Resident Evil doesn't exactly end the strongest either, but I think it still shows an interesting way of addressing this problem. Instead of trying to ride the high of the game's opening hour for the entire playthrough, it slowly shifts towards a focus on linear level design and visceral action. Not only does this make for a satisfying ending, as you get to turn the tables on everything that used to spook you, but it also works to mask the Sweet Home problem where survival horror games inevitably become less scary the closer you get to the finish line. I want to be clear that in comparing these games, I'm not trying to make the argument that the problems with Sweet Home and JRPGs broadly lie squarely with their turn-based combat and that real-time is the objectively better way to make games. My problem is more about the way that JRPGs approach turn-based combat and random elements. Randomization is a necessary component of most single-player games. What matters is what elements you choose to randomize. Take a game like 868 Hack, for example. It's a turn-based strategy game with a really interesting combat system. The aspects that are randomized aren't enemy behaviors or attacks, those are actually entirely deterministic. The random elements are limited to level layouts and the placement of enemies. The reason I greatly prefer this style of turn-based design is that the elements which are randomized can't really be qualitatively compared to each other. If I'm playing a JRPG and an enemy randomly decides to attack a character on low health instead of a character with full health, that is a bad outcome, plain and simple. But if I'm playing 868 Hack and it randomly decides to spawn in 2 demons and a virus instead of 2 viruses and a demon, is that better or worse? Who's to say? Because at the end of the day, all enemies behave with a consistent and predictable rule set, so assuming you're actually knowledgeable about the game, you have an equal chance of winning regardless of what the game decides to throw at you. That to me is a legitimate test of strategy and resource management. Watching this video, you may have been shouting at the screen calling me an idiot for writing off all JRPGs because of a Famicom game from 40 years ago. But here's the thing, games like Dragon Quest and Sweet Home may not have the complexity of modern titles, but they are the foundations that this genre was built on, and my argument is that that foundation is just a little bit rotten. No amount of extra party management, character customization, class systems, or press turns is going to change that in my mind. Ultimately, while I certainly have my misgivings with JRPG gameplay, I can still find value in these kinds of systems for other reasons. And I want to close this out on the note that even though I've spent this video criticizing Sweet Home, I only bothered to pick it apart this heavily because I sincerely love its ideas and its ambition. The habit for gamers to not give older RPGs the time of day is something that legitimately bothers me. So please, play this game, come to your own conclusions. It's too significant of a project to be reduced to a piece of trivia. Despite all the flaws, horror games like this just always hit for me. What can I say except that it feels like home sweet home?